So I have some good news and bad news from the LA Times August 4th edition. The headline says, researchers find way to reduce HIV fat deposits, which, as a smaller type then points out, are actually fat deposits caused by HIV meds, not by the purported presence of HIV itself. And interestingly, the treatment for the medication-induced fat displacement, which also results in deformities, facial deformities, and deformities on other parts of the body, is a medication known to cause diabetes in users. We already know that another side effect of AIDS drugs, besides the fat deposits and the bone death and so forth, is pancreatitis leading to diabetes. So here now they have a treatment drug to deal with the fat deposits that is also known to cause diabetes in users. It just doesn't seem like it's a real breakthrough. It seems like a big step backwards.
Yes, and diabetes often is associated with an increased risk of heart attacks, which, of course, is already an association of AIDS drugs with heart attacks, partly because of the increase in diabetes, cholesterol, but also because of the direct effect of AIDS drugs on muscle.
Yeah.
And one other thing, that fat displacement is often called lipodystrophy. So if you hear that word, what it basically means is that you get more fat in certain parts of your bodies and less elsewhere. It sounds a lot better when they say lipodystrophy than fat.
Yeah, usually what that looks like is thin arms, sometimes with the veins sticking out, thin legs, sometimes with the veins sticking out, then kind of a barrel chest.
Right.
And lumps of fat on the back of the neck.
Right.
And then fat displacement, it disappears from the face right around the mouth area where the cheeks begin. So that's one way some friends of mine say they can go to a gym in West Hollywood and see who's on the meds.
Yeah, I've noticed that myself. You get very distinct lines on the face where the fat has been removed around some of the parts of the face.
Here's a headline from the Los Angeles Times again on August 6th. The U.S. Centers for Disease Control says that 250,000 Americans are HIV infected and don't know it. I always wonder about this statement because if the people who are supposedly infected don't know it, how does the CDC know what they don't know?
That's a convoluted question, but it's a really good question. How the heck do they know this, or are they just hoping that there's a bunch of people out there that they can give this wonderful information? Oh, by the way, you're HIV positive and you think you're healthy now, but you're really going to drop dead sometime soon.
It's funny you should mention the word hope because it comes up later in the article. I'll continue here. Quote, yeah. The release of the data, they actually call that data, saying that a bunch of people don't know they're positive, but they know somehow. That's right. Considered data. Was timed to coincide with the International AIDS Conference being held this week in Mexico City. I just think that's really weird because the CDC has been making the same claim about knowing how many people don't know they're positive for years. But apparently they decided to release this as, quote, new data while the world media is hanging on every word uttered at that conference in Mexico, apparently as a way to get mileage out of this old story.
They got to have something new to say, I guess.
Yeah, even if what the new things they say are old.
Yes, even if they're just hoping people don't notice they've said it before.
Yeah. In September 2006, the article says, the CDC recommended that all Americans be offered HIV testing as part of their routine medical care. And apparently, this is me talking now, that move didn't make for enough positive results because in 2007, and I'll quote again, the agency allocated additional funds to test an extra 20 million people, primarily African Americans, in hopes of identifying, just like you said, David, in hopes of identifying 20,000 more HIV positives. They don't have enough.
That's 1 out of 1,000. Am I right? 20 million, 20,000, that's
Uh-huh.
They're hoping 1 out of 1,000, which is probably the rate of false positives.
Yeah, I guess it's not a huge hope, but it is a hope nonetheless. And I think it's really odd that they're hoping to find all these positive people.
Yes.
The CDC also claims in this article, quote, that an individual who is unaware of their infection is 3 times more likely to transmit the virus than someone who knows their status. And I'm just wondering, where do they get this 3 times more likely thing? Because as far as I know, and maybe you can help me here with this, David, the Padian study was the only one that attempted to quantify how often, quote, HIV transmits to a partner. And what they found in studying people who, in a couple, one who tested positive and one who tested negative, is that there were no transmissions.
Yes.
So the 3 times more likely, where's that coming from?
Well,
and I noticed that these stories that reported, they're all reported by the same journalist who, in my opinion, maybe not asking the same questions that you and I are asking ourselves and our listeners and each other today.
Well, he's probably he probably drew the short straw. All the other journalists are probably in Beijing for the Olympics. He got sent to Mexico City for the AIDS conference instead.
Yeah, I guess it's really hot and smoggy down there right now.
Yes.
But I would really like to know upon what basis the CDC claims to know how many people who don't know that they're infected, how they know what people don't know, how they know that people who don't know they are infected are 3 times more likely to, quote, transmit than people who know. And there's another article here on post-exposure prophylaxis, again coming out of the Mexico City AIDS conference, that I'd really like to know where this kind of stuff comes from, because it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. This article says HIV drugs to be tested as protection. Researchers are conducting trials to determine whether existing treatments can help block infections. What that means is giving these very powerful toxic AIDS drugs to people who are HIV negative. And apparently in large numbers. The article says, disheartened by the failures of vaccines and microbicides in blocking HIV transmission, some AIDS researchers are now touting a third possibility, using existing drugs prophylactically. Prophylactically means as prevention.
Right.
By next year, as many as 15,000 people, later they say that these people are men, worldwide will be enrolled in trials to test this concept. According to a report issued Sunday at the International AIDS Conference in Mexico City, there are 7 trials of this nature underway or planned. And they're saying that they need to look for new ways that people can protect themselves, and that clearly this is one of the most promising things we have in the pipeline right now. What's interesting about that promising idea is it's based on the concept of post-exposure prophylaxis, or PEP, which is that you take AIDS drugs to treat the fear that you might be positive after an exposure. You're not actually treating something that's there or known to be there, shown to be there. You're treating a fear. And they've never done any study where they divide the scared people into 2 groups. The scared people who want to take these powerful toxic chemicals to treat their fear, and people who are equally scared but decide to decline the medication, and see at the end of a certain period of time how many people from each group end up testing positive. That's never been done.
Well, more to the point, they should see, 10 years down the road how many people who took the drugs are healthy versus those who didn't take the drugs.
But to base a new kind of use for drugs on an old use for drugs that has never been substantiated as useful through rigorous testing, it seems pretty, I don't know.
Well, I did some research into post-exposure prophylaxis a couple years ago, and I found only really one paper that was referenced everywhere that claimed that it was actually effective at reducing the rate of HIV infection. I mean, that's not even taking into account the fact that post-exposure prophylaxis is being associated with liver failure even after very short durations, and that large percentages of the nurses and other people who take this because they had an uncontrolled exposure at work, large percentages drop out because of the toxic side effects. But this one paper took the data that said that AZT was not effective, and through some statistical manipulations that I've never been able to get my head around, they then claimed the opposite, that although all the data they had showed that it wasn't effective, if you massage it statistically, you can get the data to say that it is effective. And I've never been able to find a statistician to take the time to go through this and find out whether this is a legitimate statistical technique or not. And I think at best what it says is that maybe they've generated a hypothesis They haven't proven anything. It would be something worth testing maybe, but they are using it to say that it's proven that post-exposure prophylaxis is safe. But I think these people are skating on extremely thin ice, because they're going to be giving toxic AIDS drugs to HIV-negative people, and when the side effects come out, they can't perform their normal tricks of saying, that was due to HIV. It was determined.
Right, that'll be very interesting to see what happens, because anything that happens to a positive person, even when it's clearly a drug side effect, is attributed to HIV. And just another thing here that strikes me about this article is that this new use of drugs for people who want to take them before they even have what they think is maybe a risk exposure, they always come up with these happy names for things. This is called PrEP. It's pre-exposure prophylaxis, so it's no longer PEP, it's PrEP. And the concept is take a drug, give it to people daily, it says, at risk of contracting the virus. So would you take like a vitamin every day, just indefinitely? It's really scary.
Well, I might take a vitamin every day if I felt it prevented cancer or something, because I know that the vitamins aren't going to cause any side effects. But would I take a black box label drug on a daily basis in order to prevent something? I mean, the problem here is that if you're giving people something for an event that's really rare, even if side effects are, say, 1 out of 100 people, if the event is 1 out of 1,000 people, then you're going to have 10 times as many side effects as benefits.
But we know that this will be causing side effects in more than just one person. It's probably going to be an extraordinarily high number, and I wonder what kind of reporting will be done on that. What's concerning here, too, is the people that they're testing this on. You said what kind of people would want to do that? Apparently, Dr. Robert Grant of UC San Francisco is leading one trial that he intends to enroll 3,000 HIV-negative gay men in Peru, Ecuador, and the United States. Half will receive Truvada daily, and half will receive a placebo.
They have an incredibly dangerous strategy, because if these trials blow up and if they kill a bunch of healthy HIV-negative men, they've got nowhere to hide. They can't say, well, it was the HIV that did it.
I don't know. They always manage to put a spin on these things.
Well, they may just cover up the side effects. That would be my guess. I mean, if they're not going to cover up the side effects, they're shooting themselves in the foot, and there's a lot of money resting on these trials. So I think they have a plan.
See what happens.
Is it time for my news item?
Sure.
Yeah, I just have one this week, and it's not even on HIV and AIDS directly, but I think you'll see the parallels. 50 women were locked up in an insane asylum between 1907 and the 1990s because they were typhoid carriers, healthy typhoid carriers. Here's the BBC reporter.
Rosina Bryans was locked up in the asylum for 60 years. She, along with nearly 50 other women, spent most of her life in isolation. The reason? They were typhoid carriers.
That's right. On the basis of a test, in the absence of any illness, these people's lives were completely destroyed. Does this sound familiar?
Very.
A nurse who worked at the asylum in the 1960s describes how securely these women were locked away from the world. The part about toilets describes the fear that surrounded these poor women better than anything.
When you entered the building, the first thing you did was put on a surgical gown. We also at times wore masks. We used a lot of Lysol and carbolic soap, where we had to scrub up to the elbows and this sort of thing. And when you flushed the toilet, it was actually boiling water.
These women were obviously denied human contact, even by the staff, and none of them were ever allowed visitors. And these are decades that they spent in solitary confinement. No wonder many of them went insane, a fact that was used by the British government to justify their continued confinement. Here's a statement by the British government read by an actor.
26 female typhoid carriers are strictly isolated. Most of them are, however, so deteriorated mentally that the restriction on their activities which results from their segregation is not likely to be felt by them as hardship.
This was not a century ago. Confinement of healthy women as typhoid carriers might have started in 1907, but incredibly enough, the last of these women died in confinement in 1998.
Wow.
This is such a perfect example of how the fear of a supposedly infectious disease can turn an entire society against a group of people that they have been trained to fear. What was interesting to me is that the BBC report, despite describing the horror of the situation, didn't even question the science behind it. The question of whether these women really were a deadly danger to others was not even asked.
You know, this reminds me, too, this program today is about testing. And there was a news story a few summers ago about a man named Jim Malone who, in essence, confined himself. He, after testing positive during a routine exam when he was hospitalized in '86 for an operation, he just shut down his entire life. He spent the next 8 years living in total terror at home, and over time, he lost about 25% of his body weight. He became so sick he was diagnosed as near terminal and became totally dependent on a home care nurse. Then he retested negative at the recommendation of a new doctor, and what's interesting about his case is he never took AIDS meds that oftentimes make people so ill, and apparently it was his self-imposed confinement and his fear and hopelessness that made him sick, because within a couple of weeks of finding out he was negative, his health problems all started clearing up on their own.
Yeah, there's a doctor on the East Coast, Dr. Matt Irwin, who wrote an entire paper on what he calls bone pointing, which is the psychological impact of a death sentence. And, you know, primitive tribes would perhaps point a bone at someone they wanted to shun and issue a curse, and that person would go off and die. It was an incredible psychological terrorism, and now we're seeing just more sophisticated forms of psychological terrorism through HIV diagnoses.
And there's not that much difference between an HIV test and the bone, because the bone only has the power of authority that people invest in it through their beliefs.
That's
HIV
right.
tests, similarly, don't have the capacity to truly tell who's infected. They don't look for or find the virus, and they've never been validated by the direct purification of the virus from people who test positive. So it's all our belief about what they mean that creates everything that happens after that.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of people whose lives have been turned around, A, when they accepted the diagnosis, and B, when they truly rejected it again.
Right. Well, I think it's about time for us to give our first guest,
I think so.
Mike, a call, and I'll see if I can get him on the line.
Okay.
So, Mike, welcome to How Positive Are You?
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Hi, Mike.
Thanks for being here.
Thanks. Hi, David.
Hi.
So, Mike, tell us a little bit about yourself before we get into what happened with your HIV testing adventures.
Absolutely. Well, I am a 28-year-old male. I worked in the defense and aerospace industry and worked in many jobs that basically took me a lot overseas, lots of traveling, and, really doing something that I love. I've come from a strong background of academic and educated individuals. Both my parents are in the medical profession. They're both doctors. I have 3 siblings, and they're all in the medical profession as well, including cousins and in-laws. So I've always been surrounded with a strong work ethic and a lot of background in medicine, and always, it's always been a lively upbringing just in terms of, debate and always, pursuing knowledge, always looking to learn about new things, and that sort of brought me on my career path to where I am today.
So what prompted you to take a so-called HIV test?
Well, it always comes down to that one moment, that phone call, I guess. I don't think of myself as, or at the time, let's say this was in 2005, I didn't think of myself as, being a person in any particular risk group. Always, ate, lived healthy, never, came down with any major diseases or problems. And I got a call one day, and it was from actually basically a former girlfriend. It was, an encounter, and she said that she had tested HIV positive, and that, of course, that was the first time. I didn't even know anybody who was, frankly, so-called HIV positive or an AIDS patient, and that was just a shock to me. It was devastating to hear that, and my initial reaction was to feel bad for her and to reach out, but then, your mind starts playing tricks on you, and you start thinking back, wow, all, everything that could have happened, and immediately, I just had the sense. I was like, wow, I feel like I must be, I was obviously at risk. Maybe, I'm HIV positive. And but before I ran and got a test, something inside, I don't know what it was, something instinctual said, well, just do some research. And I just, went online. Actually, she called me late in the evening, so it wasn't even possible for me to run to the nearest hospital. And so I just went online and started doing research. And everything I have to say I read, it came from all what we call, the orthodoxy. It was extremely depressing. It was, I remember my first Google search was HIV and life expectancy. And I think, stuff came up that was like 10 years, 15 years, 5 years, with meds, you can live forever and so forth. And so I was like, okay, well, great. So obviously, death is on the mind because everyone tells you this is such a debilitating, terminal disease, no way out. And I just started reading up about it, and, I went to websites like on the, National Health Institute websites and thebody.com and all those websites, AIDS Meds and so forth. And I just read one post after another, one story after another, and it just got me so down and so depressed just reading about the side effects of the medications and just how, everyone just seems so miserable on those, the forums, posting about their conditions and help groups and everything. And I just was thinking, my God, I don't want to be that person. It seems so depressing, everything. And I'm a pretty active person. I do a lot of, sports and stuff. And really it just seemed like, wow, this could all end for me. And that was my initial response. So I actually didn't want to take a test. I was like, shoot, I'm afraid of the results because this is just absolutely the worst thing that could happen to me. And at the time, it wasn't so much about my job situation, but it was more like, at first I was just like, the slogan, knowing is beautiful. To me, I was like, knowing is terrifying. This is the absolute worst thing that could happen. It was just petrifying. But I kept on reading and kept on researching more and more and more. And finally, I said, okay, well, this is making me sick. It's making me physically ill. And so I decided, actually having read, I hadn't read at this point many dissident sites. I had just sort of was aware that there was another side, but, I didn't take it too seriously. But I had enough inclination to say, I read enough horror stories about people who took the test and they were either false positive or when they took them, lost their insurance, and it was really difficult to maintain those types of, it seemed like you were blacklisted and sent to an intern camp or something. That's what I imagined in my head. And so I said, wow, let's slow down here for a second. And I remember thinking, I think there's some home tests that one could take. And that's when I started doing research, and I actually ordered a home HIV test.
So that's where you got your positive results?
Yeah, so I got it, and if I don't know what the situation is today anymore, but this was now 2005, so 3 years ago. It was actually May 2005. I ordered a test. It was from France because I believe at the time there was no FDA-approved so-called HIV home test. I could be wrong, but at any rate, at that time it was my impression. And this one boasted, 99.9% accuracy. Know in the privacy of your home, so you can, essentially cry over the results in private instead of in public. And to me, it was just, I thought, well, that's at least the best. I can control the environment. And I was just petrified people finding out. And that was even, thinking about taking an anonymous test. I said, no way, I'm not going to go out in public and do this. So that's why the private test seemed the most appealing. And then I did it, and by the way, so the test came. It took about 2 weeks to arrive, and during that 2-week period, I swear my health just started, dovetailing. I mean, it absolutely went downhill. I got sick. I had a fever. I had flu-like symptoms. I wasn't feeling good. People at work were like, go home, you don't look good. And it was just this malaise that sort of came over me in anticipation of this test.
Or some people might say that is seroconversion sickness.
Right, exactly, which is exactly what I was thinking in my head. I go, great, I am seroconverting, because it matched up. It was about a month after, my ex gave me a call, and so it matched into their little convenient timelines. And I said, great, this is a seroconversion. Backstory quickly, a week actually before I got the call, I had been on a lake and I had been water skiing, and I got an ear infection from the lake. And I was actually still sick from there, but I think I had a few days where I was in recovery in between, and then finding out, I immediately became sick again. So, so in the back of my mind, though, I'm only thinking this is seroconversion sickness. And then the tests arrived, and, I had maybe 102-degree fever. I was really sick, but I was determined to do it because I was like, this will kill me if I don't find out. And then I got the test, and it was one of those blood pricks. And the pricker was actually broken. And it was almost comical if it weren't so serious at the time. I couldn't prick my finger to get any blood out. And it's almost like, you can break your finger open on accident any time of the day. But when I was actually trying to draw blood, nothing came out. And so finally I took a razor. And
God.
That's desperate I was. Yeah. I mean, this is almost like out of some suicide horror flick. And I started sort of slashing my fingertip with this razor, and then finally got blood to come out, squeezed it onto the, it was like a little tray. And then, it was very specific about the directions. Put 2 drops on the tray, and then there was like a serum, which is, I guess it dilutes it or something. I don't know what it was, but at any rate, I dropped the serum on top of it, and then it said to wait 20 minutes. And then 20 minutes went by, and I picked it back up, and, I mean, petrified. Like, this was really, in the back of my mind, too, I had grown up in a medical community, so HIV/AIDS was actually something we had discussed. And somehow in the back of my mind, whether it was subconscious or whatnot from my upbringing, it had always petrified me just because it was this devastating disease. I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and when it was really just coming down hard. And everyone, so, that was, of course, in the back of my mind. And then 20 minutes later, I picked up the test, and there were 2 very distinct bars, which was indicative of a positive test.
Wow. So how did that leave you feeling, briefly?
Like initially when I saw it?
Yeah, initially, and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was, well, I was nuts. I mean, I was, the box, I kept on reading the box insert that said this is 99%, accurate. And, I'm not a lucky person in life. Everything that I earned, I had to work for, and I felt like there's no way in hell I'm that 1% error. I was just convinced that this was true. So, I mean, it really changed my life completely.
And how long did you live with this positive diagnosis before you were retested again?
Exactly 3 years, actually, almost to the day. The initial false positive was in May 2005, and I took the new test end of May 2008. So it was 3 years exactly. And those 3 years, I can tell you what, I mean, on one side I became extremely educated, and that's when I was actually first exposed to aliveandwell.com. I purchased Christine's book, which was a great, primer for me, just somebody who wasn't, even though I could read medical documents, I felt like I needed a more layman or, explanation. So, and, Christine, your book was great for that. And so, and then just reading all the resources online, but I have to say I was still a skeptic. I'm not somebody who embraces conspiracy theory. I'm not somebody who tends to think that, either governments are out to cheat us or get us, or the medical community or anyone for that matter. So for me, it was a tentative dance with dissidents. That's the best way I can describe it. And but what I did those 3 years was, exploring. And what I liked was the fact that, like Christine, your website, and even the information that I saw on virusmyth.com and those websites, it presented it in a very logical and not ideological way, which I think, which is very off-putting if something is telling you that, there's this grand conspiracy and, all these whack job theories. But, these were like, look at the evidence for yourself. And, in my job, I'm a big researcher, and everything I do is research to the key, like, making sure that, you cross your T's and dot your I's, and that every little, citation is mentioned and gone back on. I mean, that was so important. So that's what I did. I took something like Live and Well and those other websites where they said, go back to Gallo's original paper, go back and look at, what the NIH puts out, and challenge the assumptions. And that's what I did. So I backtracked, and I found all those original papers that claim that, HIV leads to AIDS or whatever. And, it was clear to me then that, wow, that the medical science, the orthodoxy supposedly, didn't get their facts straight. I mean, they were the ones that were erring, or at least enough to where I said, this is, there's some doubt here that what they've been telling us all this long, it clearly doesn't match up, with the viral load and isolation of the virus and the fact that, how certain demographics and groups are so stricken and others are not, and how it varies by continent. I mean, these are all things I could verify, and I challenge any, listener to this radio station, to this radio program, to do that and not, just take our word for it or your word for it, but to go out and find it for yourself, and you will be extremely surprised as I was. And so, I kept on going on this 2-track. I still read all the Orthodox papers, but the more I did that, the more I realized that they were already starting on this foundation that, to them it was already rock solid, and I felt like when I got the so-called dissident view that I had a really great balance, and that I felt like it was actually poking some logical holes into this. And I had to be honest. I had to say, am I wishing this to be true because, I think I'm positive or I know I'm positive? And that to me, that was the big challenge. Like, is this all wishful thinking or is this reality?
How was your health during all of this, looking for answers and living with basically a secret? I understand that you kept this a secret from your friends and your family. And how was your health impacted by this? And did you ever consider taking medications?
Yes, to all those. So I didn't tell anybody, partially because I didn't know how, partially because, I guess I was ashamed, and partially because I didn't know how this would impact my work. I had, future aspirations to do certain things, which I knew would be more in the public limelight, and it could affect me extremely adversely. So I was determined to keep this a secret. So what happened was, well, health-wise, it was 2 phases. Initially, I got extremely sick. I mean, I made myself, looking back now, I know I made myself sick. I came down with fevers. I had sore throat. I got strep throat for the first time in my life. And I'm in great shape. I do a lot of activities, a lot of sports. And I had never, ever, since I was, 8 years old, come down with any major illness. And it was like within a 4-month period, I was getting flu, fever, strep throat. I mean, just like that. And it was extremely, and of course I thought, oh, well, this is HIV. This is what it does. It's doing what it's supposed to do. That's what I kept on telling myself, and it just sort of started tail spinning. And then it was almost like my secret religion was reading dissident websites, and that was the only thing that actually kind of made me feel better. And as I become wiser, I had to learn everything from scratch. I mean, there's really little I knew except what everyone sort of thinks they know, is that HIV causes AIDS, and AIDS is a disease, not a compilation of 30 pre-existing diseases, and so forth. And so it was really a slow and tedious process. But I have to say, through that, when I determined that I didn't want to live with the drugs, I mean, I knew that as, let's say, as an Orthodox believer in the beginning, I said, I don't want to take these drugs because, I remember drawing a sketch, just reading from the symptoms, And I took out a piece of paper, and I recommend anyone do this because it actually puts a amusing, if not stark, image in your mind. And I started drawing just a stick figure, and then I read the symptom, and it said, "Oh, you get a camel hump or a hump," and then so I drew a hump on the person, and then it talked about Crick's belly, and so I drew a big belly, and then it talked about skinny arms and wiry frame legs. So I drew these really tiny arms and legs, and then it talked about every symptom from balding to sunken cheeks.
And now these are all drug side effects, not symptoms of so-called HIV infection.
Right. So, but of course, I thought those were symptoms. I mean, I wasn't. I was lost in my world of. I mean, part of it was drug side effects, but the orthodoxy will also say, oh, well, that's also HIV progression, but then dementia, all that stuff. So I wrote all these down. And I just had I was looking at this cartoon I drew, and it was just like a total monstrosity. I mean, it was and then, of course, you can find pictures of people, and just go on AIDSmeds.com, and you'll just see hundreds of people lamenting all their illnesses and side effects. And I just felt wow. I'm you know what? I'm going to be dead in 5 years anyway. This is my mentality. I'm let's make the best of it. And so I said, if I'm going to live with this, I'm going to try to do it, alternative, through alternative medicines and everything. And that's when Christine, your website came in. David, actually, I read a lot of articles that you had written as well, and promoting alternative, healthy eating and lifestyle. And that's what I did. And I felt immediately better. And in fact, if there's one good thing that came out of this, it's that I became an extremely healthy eater. Felt a lot better about myself. Saw myself get noticeably healthier, and started enjoying life more. So to answer your question, Christine, I was really sick in the beginning, and then when I sort of made this determination as an Orthodox believer that I wouldn't take meds, I kind of released myself from that burden about, do I go to the hospital today? Do I go tomorrow? And frankly, purely out of fear. I didn't want to look like the monster I'd drawn on the picture. And I said, well, you know what? It's better to live a few years to your fullest than on government assistance in bed all day. I mean, that's how I felt at any rate.
What prompted you to test again?
Yeah, so 3 years went by, and let's just say I didn't feel great about everything because I still felt like there was this huge burden on me. But on the other hand, I felt like I figured out a way to manage it. And by the way, in those 3 years, with the exception of the first 3 months, I never fell sick, never had an illness, nothing serious, a headache, that would have been the extent. So, so how did I end up testing again? Well, I had a job requirement, basically. Two things. One was to basically, I needed to travel frequently, every couple months to Russia. And the Russian visa for business people, if you go more than 90 days a year, requires you to get an HIV test. That was one thing. And then the other thing was just for other tests and things that I needed for work. I knew that blood tests were required, and they always flippantly say, "Oh, don't worry." But when I looked up the fine print, I realized HIV test was one of those blood tests. So I had two things that were happening that told me that eventually, if not tomorrow, you're going to have to get this test. And with Russia, I was able to defer it because you can go on tourist visas, which is what I did. You don't have to take the test, but those get expensive because you have to keep on getting them. And then finally, work said, "Well, you need a business. We're not going to let you go on tourist visa every time." So then I said, "Great. This is now they're basically telling me I have to do it." And I knew that, either I quit my job and leave everything I love, or I test. In the back of my mind, at this point, let's call me a fully converted believer in the rethinking side. I realized that my test, since I was ill when I took it and so forth the first time, that it could have been a false positive. And of course, not believing in the test, I knew that obviously there's so many ways that these things cross-react that it probably was inaccurate. But let's face it, even if we know that it's not going to do anything to us, nobody out there understands that, or very few people do, and the test is all that they have. And so if I weren't, going to take the test, it was hard for me to explain, don't worry, guys, it's a false positive. Russia let me into your country anyways.
That's not going to work.
Yeah, exactly. That argument would have never flown,
Especially not in Russia.
Yeah, exactly. And try explaining that to them. And I just knew it wasn't going to work, so I knew I had to do it. So instead of doing a home test, though, this time, in fact, I set up a meeting with a doctor in a doctor's office. And I called them up and I asked them about the protocol. And that's when they informed me that if you test positive, in fact, we release your statistics to the CDC. And I said, can you withhold my name? And they're like, it was almost a joke. They're like, why would we do that? And I said, okay, you know what, forget it. So I hung up, and I remember reading, okay, you can do these anonymous clinics. So I went to an anonymous clinic in Los Angeles, and I got the test there, and it was an OraSure, and which is it's a oral test where they basically swab your mouth.
Right.
And so I went in, and it's kind of funny. It was like blazing hot in May, and I wore a cap and a long jacket. I looked like a villain, because I felt like I had to hide my identity. I didn't know what would happen, if the whole thing would go in lockdown if I had a positive, and they would somehow get my real name from me and release it and everything. I mean, those were the exaggerated images I had, so I was being extremely cautious. And so I went in and I said, okay, let's do this, and did the oral swab, and and then there's like a 20-minute wait, and I was just like looking at the doorway, getting ready to bolt if she said it was positive, and then the woman, the technician there, who incidentally knew very little about the disease, because for 20 minutes they're supposed to sort of counsel you about what if, and she was like, oh, you're good, you're negative, and then my jaw dropped, and I was a little overwhelmed.
Wow, was that the only test that you had? Did you then go for a not anonymous test to get something more official?
Correct. So the anonymous test was my setup, because I realized that if that had come positive, then I'd probably have to come to terms and just either tell work that for religious reasons I didn't want to take tests and see if they bought that, and if not, I realized that I probably would have to give up my work or other parts, or make some kind of compromises, like not do my job in Russia, for example. So anyway, so that came negative, and I decided, okay, so I called the doctor, and it wasn't my regular doctor. It was, this is almost like, back alley black market. Not, of course, it was a legitimate person, but, I went to somebody in a different part of the neighborhood in Los Angeles where I never would ever venture, and did sort of the test there. And that was just, again, me being paranoid, and just, I didn't know what to expect. And this was a blood test. This was actually, so he drew blood out of my arm and, put it through the machine. It was an ELISA test. I was again, counseled that it is extremely safe. And, I was subtly challenging and asking them questions about, if there was a positive result, would that information be released and so forth. And, they of course, they said yes, and then it came down to it. They had a waiver, and they said you have to sign this, because basically it said you allow us to do this test, and then in fine print it said, and we can release your information if you're positive. And I sat there I did not sign it for 20 minutes, and I tried to get the nurse to just give me just give me a thumbs up. I said, if it comes out negative, then I'll sign it really quick, and we won't tell the doctor, and she wouldn't do that. So I was extremely nervous, and I ended up relenting, and I said, I'm going to just trust this OraSure, which I had taken the day before. So again, I had made sure it happened right after another. If there was ever a window for me, I felt like this was it. And then the second test came back negative as well.
With regard to the young lady who called you and said that she had a positive test result, what has her experience been in this situation?
Right. Thanks, Christine. Yeah, we were in touch in the beginning, and I have to say she was, she had immediately gone to the hospital, seen the doctor. Well, obviously, I guess since she had that test, and so her parents got involved, and her family and everybody, and they were, of course, very gung-ho about whatever the most modern treatment was, and she had immediately begun treatment. Now, I had shown her, some of the alternative sites and just explained to her that I was doing research so I could have a more, collective, holistic approach. And, when she first saw it, she was very receptive, but then guess what? She brought it to her doctors, and her doctors told her that was all a bunch of bull. So then that sort of ended it. That was it. And, my influence waned, and eventually, there's just nothing more I could do except, I wished her all the best.
And during the 3 years that you thought you were HIV positive, what impact did this have on your relationships with women?
Extremely negative. Even though, I have to say, even though I felt liberated after, the first, 4 months after my initial, so-called positive announcement or notice, I felt I was very cautious and I still felt guilty, because I wasn't going to tell anybody. And so, suffice it to say that for 3 years I didn't have I wasn't able to stick to relationships very well at all. And it stemmed a lot from, this guilt. That didn't mean I didn't have them, but, I have to say I was extremely careful. And frankly, I was reading, since I was reading every day about anything HIV-related, there are obviously articles out there about people, supposedly infecting, others without telling them, and then, they land in jail. That's sort of the consequence for that. And so for me, it was a pretty rough time, and frankly, I was never actively seeking to have a relationship, and that's the truth. They did happen occasionally, but it wasn't. I was seeing somebody for 6 months. It was the longest during that period, and then there were equally long periods of time where nothing happened. So that's how that evolved.
Before we move to Richard to hear his story of testing, is there anything you want to say to people who are listening in summary about what you think now of testing? Any advice, any words to the wise for someone who might be considering testing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have to say my situation was kind of a double-edged sword because, I took the initiative to do the home test. Now, the home test was the one that, so-called delivered a false positive, but I can't say for sure that I wouldn't have had a false positive had I gone to the hospital at that time. I was ill. I had a fever when I took, the test. I had previously gone in a lake and had an ear infection. So there really could have been loads of reasons why this happened. And the fact that I took it at home, I think, did save me from, potentially any real harm than if I had gone, into a public forum. In that respect, I would caution people to obviously read up everything they can. I do not recommend testing because I think that is completely flawed. In my case, that is shown that there is no such thing as 99.9%, or at least there are a lot of those 0.1% out there, that do get the false. So, from my perspective, I would, I do not recommend testing. But if you have to do it, like in my situation, it would have to be anonymous and very carefully. But again, it's just not to be recommended. And I'd like to just say one more final thing about the medical community. I grew up in a family of doctors. My parents, my siblings, cousins, aunts, uncles, you wouldn't believe it. And I challenged them while I thought I was positive about the issues of HIV and AIDS. And I asked them very distinct questions coming from the dissident side about virus isolation, about the discrepancies in Africa, about all those things, about homosexuals versus heterosexual infection. And what surprised me the most, now granted, none of my relatives are, AIDS treating doctors, but what surprised me the most, and this is from the medical authorities themselves, they either agreed with my assertion that, oh yes, right, we understand that there are problems, that the virus isn't isolated and so forth, or they were very flippant in dismissing things like, well, in Africa, they practice different sexual practices, so that's what accounts for that. And you challenge it, and they'll just shrug it off. And so they'll hide under this shroud of authority, saying we're medical professions, so we're the only ones who can really determine if HIV leads to AIDS, or what the whole what the whole science is behind it. But the reality is, they pick up a textbook and it tells them HIV causes AIDS, and from that day on, that's what they believe. There has been no research, there's no backtracking, and when you present them with these facts, they typically agree that yes, this isn't a perfect theory, this isn't right, but it's the best thing we have. Was kind of the response. And the last thing I'll say is, my brother-in-law, who's a successful surgeon, said, well, everyone in the medical community knows that heterosexual, men and women really just don't get HIV. I said, what? And he said, yeah, I mean, maybe 1-3%, but we all know it's not a threat. And I said, but then, how can you as a medical community endorse these types of slogans and campaigns that say everyone's a threat, everyone, regardless of what color, race, sexuality, so forth? And they were like, well, I mean, that's, again, it's just what it is. So, again, that's my caution to everyone out there, to understand that even people who mean well, they actually don't know any better, and we do understand this better. Us, those in the community and the research community and the scientific community that are taking the time to backtrack and look at the bare-bones facts and try to understand what's going on.
That's an incredible story, and I'm so grateful that you have shared that with us. I think a lot of people are going to benefit from hearing it.
Yeah, thank you so much for giving us your time today.
No, I appreciate it. I really enjoy your podcast, and I hope this takes off. I think a lot of people could benefit from listening to it. Thanks for doing this, guys.
Sure, thank
you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Hi, Richard. Welcome to How Positive Are You?
Hey, Christine. How's it going?
Pretty well.
Hi, Richard. It's David.
Hey, David. How's it going?
Good.
Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
So what intrigued me about you was an experience that you communicated to me, that you had received every kind of result possible from a so-called HIV test from different labs, from the same lab, on the same day, on different days. Can you just tell us what the heck happened and why you ended up wanting to take a test in the first place?
Yeah, so to answer your question as far as why I wanted to take the HIV test, I mean, in the gay community, you're bombarded with billboards and ads all the time telling you should get tested every 6 months. So, that's what I've always done. I've always just gone every 6 months just as, routine just to get tested. So.
And what did you think that the test did or told you when you tested? And I'm assuming each time you got negative results.
Right, exactly. I mean, at the time, just like everyone else, I thought that the test would tell me if I was infected with the virus that causes AIDS or HIV. So, I had taken probably, maybe 20 tests up till now, up till then. And, of course, all of them were negative.
So what went through your head when your results came back positive?
Initially, I was shocked, and there was a lot of disbelief. I think anyone who's told, they have a terminal disease like that, I mean, they go through a lot of shock and disbelief. So, but at the same time, I had a lot of doubt because, I've never had unprotected sex, and I don't do drugs. So, basically I was really confused, and I kind of felt helpless at the time.
How did the positive result affect your life as it was at the time? Any relationships you were involved in, your friends, your family?
I think the stigma of having an HIV-positive diagnosis, I think that most people feel a lot of shame from that. Personally, I didn't tell anyone until much later because, I mean, it's obviously not a subject that's easy to bring up. And I never even mentioned it to my parents because, I didn't want them to freak out.
So after you got this positive test result, you ended up testing again. After how long, and why did you do that?
Well, basically, as far as testing again, it's kind of a complicated story. But basically, I tested preliminary positive at, I'll just say, testing center A. And it was kind of weird because, after I tested positive at the counselor's recommendation, she actually recommended that I get another test. So the same day, I went to another testing center, I'll just say testing center B, and I took another HIV test, and that test actually came back negative. So that was just like maybe 2 or 3 hours later.
So between one place and another, you had a positive and a negative test result.
Yeah, and actually, it's more complicated than that because I actually had more than just those 2 tests done. I actually had a total of 4 rapid tests done, and I actually had 2 positives and 2 negatives. So that was really, very confusing to me. And actually what was even more, I think, crazy was the fact that at Testing Center B, I actually had 2 tests at the same time, and 1 test actually came back positive and 1 test came back negative at the exact same time.
Was this like an ELISA and a Western blot, or?
Actually, the 4 that I'm speaking of right now were actually ELISA. So those were the rapids, and 2 came back positive, 2 came back negative. The 2 that they gave me at the same time were also ELISAs, which 1 came back positive and negative immediately. So, I mean, it happened in front of my eyes as well as the counselor. So that was really confusing for both me and the counselor. I actually did take 2 Western blots, and that was also interesting because Testing Center A did a Western blot and Testing Center B did a Western blot, and they both actually had conflicting results. So,
you said in some information you sent us 1 was indeterminate, is that right? And 1
yeah,
was...
so Testing Center A, I thought it was kind of funny because Testing Center A, which initially told me I was preliminary positive, ended up telling me, well, we don't think so because you're getting an indeterminate Western blot. And then Testing Center B, which initially told me I was negative, ended up telling me, oh, yes, you're positive.
Why did they do a Western blot if your ELISA was negative? That seems unusual.
That's a good question. The reason why, well, when I went to Testing Center B, because I was so concerned, they offered another test, I guess the viral load test.
Right.
And so I had asked them, or it might have been another test, but in any case, I had asked them to do another test that they offered, and they did the test, and because the results were reactive, they decided to do a Western blot. So even though I tested negative on the ELISA, which was the rapid test, because they had a positive result or a positive reaction on another test they took, they did the Western blot.
Jeez, were you paying for all of this?
No, thankfully I wasn't. I wasn't paying for any of it.
So you must have had some suspicions about these tests. This seems like you were testing the tests by doing all this.
You know what? I actually came to realize much later that that's exactly what happened. And, I think that whether you're gay or you're straight or whatever, everybody takes these tests as the end-all, be-all, and I don't think that most people realize that there's much more to these tests that we haven't been told about. And I know that with my own experience that basically these tests are not accurate, and nowhere near as accurate as, they say they are. And I don't know if you guys heard, and you probably have, but, just recently the New York City actually stopped doing the oral rapid test because they were having such high false positives.
Yeah, that's the second time they've had to do that. I think.
I believe that was the second time. I know that they stopped it in Los Angeles and San Francisco a while back, but just this year, just a couple months ago, I know that they stopped testing.
Of course, their definition of a true positive is if they do a Western blot.
Exactly.
And it's positive, then it's a true positive, but they don't have any way to validate the Western blot.
Exactly, and that's, I think that was the most eye-opening experience for me because, when I went to Testing Center A, they said I was indeterminate, and, I went to Testing Center B, and they said I was positive, and, they actually showed me the results, and, Testing Center A, there was only, I guess, the P24 band that was just indeterminate, and then the test from Testing Center B, it was completely different. Pretty much all the proteins were lit up. So it just really opened my eyes and really proved to me these tests were not accurate.
Well, what were you thinking when you were getting these various results? Were you thinking you're positive? Were you thinking this was going to have a big impact on your life?
Yeah, I mean, obviously before when I first got my first test, obviously I was just really I guess I could sum it up in 2 words. I mean, I felt really, things were really bleak and hopeless. It was just, I kind of felt like I had to give up on any dreams I had, and, basically I would be left living a life that was always going to have this cloud following me around.
So if there was a period of time in which you thought you were positive, what did you do in response to testing positive? Did you go see a doctor? Did you consider taking drug therapies?
It was interesting that you asked that, Christine, because, at the Testing Center B, because, first of all, both counselors were just completely dumbfounded. They had never seen results like this. And, I had mentioned to them that I had done some research, and the counselor actually told me that I was doing too much research. So
Yeah, there's a disease called thinking too much-itis.
I think so. But, basically I've always thought of myself as a rational person. So, after I received the first positive, obviously, just like anybody else, I was in shock, disbelief. But, I just started doing a lot of research, and, that's how I came to find your website and actually many others that offered another side of the story. And I think it's a huge side of the story that I think is that very little of it is that the public is aware of.
So after you accessed this research, what did you think your prospects were? If at that time you believed you were positive, but seeing another side, did that do anything for you?
Oh, yeah. I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think that after I had done the research and I had really looked more deeply into it, I think that basically it was a complete turnaround for me. I went from feeling hopeless to optimistic, and whether or not, because I was still waiting for my confirmatory result, whether or not it came back positive or negative, I still had a much more optimistic outlook on life, in general.
And what's your feeling now about your so-called HIV status? Do you consider it to have any value, or have you rejected it entirely?
It's really hard to get to get that idea of HIV because it's been so ingrained, I think in most people. It's really hard to get it out. Honestly, I really don't know where I stand with that, but, I feel whether or not I test positive or negative is not a huge deal to me because I think it's not what we were led to believe.
So you ultimately retested negative,
Yes.
and I'm assuming you had multiple negative tests after all these flip-flops back and forth. How did that occur?
Well, basically, so, I had several positives, several negatives, so they were like, well, this is what you need to do. And, this is their reasoning. They were like, well, you might be seroconverting or something to that effect. And I was like, okay, that's fine, so what do we need to do next? And they were like, well, you just need to wait a month and then just come back and we'll just do another test. So basically, I just waited 2 months, and I went back, and they just did one more test, which was supposed to be my confirmatory test, and it came back negative.
Have you tested again since then, or are you
I haven't tested again since then, no.
Stop while you're ahead?
And
stop while you're ahead, exactly.
Was there anything that happened around the time of your all mixed-up tests that you think might have triggered these sort of false positives, strange reactions like a vaccination or an illness of some kind?
Yeah, actually, two things. I'm glad you asked that. Well, it's funny because when I went to go get the test in the first place, I was hesitant to do it because I wasn't feeling well. And, I had actually mentioned that to one of the counselors, like, look, I think I've got a cold, I think I'm sick. I was like, do you think that it's going to have any effect on the test? And she said, absolutely not. And so that's why I went ahead and went through. But, I think the thing that really just kind of upset me the most was that the counselors never tried prying. They just looked at the results that were in front of them and just were like, well, something's wrong, but we don't know what it is. But they didn't try to probe. And, if they had tried asking me about my history 3 months prior to taking these tests, 3 or 4 months prior to taking these tests, I was on a long course of antibiotics. And there was basically a period where I basically went from antibiotic to antibiotic because my doctor thought I just had a bacterial infection. Well, after being on the antibiotics for so long, I just started getting really sick, and I think that, most people aren't aware that antibiotics don't only kill your bad bacteria, they end up killing your good bacteria.
Right, and they, if you do it long enough, you can start getting fungal infections.
Exactly, so, people get candidiasis or yeast infections, and I personally never developed any of those, but I did get very sick, and I know that you can get fungal and viral infections. Well, I got a cold, and that's when I ended up taking the test.
So what do you think now, after having had this experience about people, you said in the gay community it's common practice to go often and to put a lot of value and weight on the test. How do you feel about that now, and how do you relate to people, let's say, in your community who believe that this is an important thing to do and an accurate test they're taking?
Well, honestly, I have mixed feelings, as far as the test goes. I think that, I guess, are you asking me what is, just overall the testing, like, what do I think about the testing in general, or what does it mean to test positive, or?
Well, what does it mean to you now as a member of a community of people who It's like a rite of passage. It's a standard way of operating. It's like it gives you your walking papers. It's so common to do these tests.
Right.
What do you ever say? Do you ever tell people about your experiences, and how do you feel just about supporting that idea that people should be tested often and tested repeatedly?
Right. Well, you know what? Whenever that comes up, obviously I only share my experience with close friends because it's still something that's very private. But I guess that anytime the discussion comes up, I do mention what I do know, and I think that the gay community especially is just rather disadvantaged because they're just not getting the information, or we're not getting the information that all of these scientists and these researchers know. And I guess overall, I would just say I have mixed feelings. I mean, my own experience has proven to me that these tests are nowhere near as accurate as we're told. That in fact they can have an accuracy as low as 50%. Second, I feel that as far as HIV tests, I really feel that they should just stop calling it an HIV test, because I know this is another discussion, but there are so many other things that can cause a false positive on these tests. I don't think that anyone can say whether a positive result is because someone is truly infected with HIV or if it's being caused by one of these other conditions. And, Christine, I know you got on your website, and there's so many other conditions like pregnancy, like vaccinations, like flu that can cause a false positive. So, how do we know that that's actually the virus that we're testing for, or something else?
And beyond that, too, as David and I know, and we discuss on this program, no one has, scientifically speaking, in the scientific realm, there's never been a study that takes a group of, say, 1,000 people who test positive for antibodies or DNA or RNA, which are substitutes for finding the virus itself,
right,
and has established of these 1,000 people who are positive for the substitutes, how many actually have the virus itself that can be directly purified from their blood. That's never been done. So
right.
Even when we say false positive, true positive, there's no standard for that. There's no scientific study anywhere that establishes what a true positive looks like.
Exactly. And, that's the thing that really is hard to get across when I, try to talk to people about this. They just don't get it. And it just really blows my mind that, this virus, that HIV has never been properly, I guess, isolated or purified. And so, I think that at the very least, it's the responsible thing to do would be to at least tell people that do test positive that, that there's other things that could be causing a positive result, and, it could be a false positive if, for whatever that's worth.
I've often thought, I've realized that would be impossible for the AIDS establishment. I mean, if you came in to a doctor's office and they said, okay, we've given you this HIV test, and what it means is there's a 90% chance that you're HIV infected and a 10% chance that you're not. And if you're HIV infected, we want to go on drugs that will cause all kinds of side effects. But if you're if you're HIV infected, they will help you in the long run, but if you're not, they'll just harm you. I think a lot of people would say, gee, I'm healthy now, so maybe I should figure out whether I'm in that 10% or not by waiting to see if I get sick.
Right.
And all of a sudden, they'd lose so many people. So they have to say it's 99.9% accurate.
Well,
otherwise,
exactly. I mean, how do you give someone a test that you're not even sure of yourself? And what's sad is that's exactly what's going on. And I know that from my own experience that was the case, because if I had only gone to one testing center, they could have very well told me that I was positive, and I never would have gone back to check again.
Well, there's a woman who is recently in the news, Audrey Serrano, who had the experience of testing positive and believing it, and in response to that started taking the drugs that were prescribed to her. She became very, very sick over the course of several years, and terrible consequences personally to her life, including the loss of the custody of her daughter. And then all of a sudden she retests and she's negative.
Yeah, I heard about that, and I think that that's the reason why I'm talking with you guys right now. I really think that I think that it really is a moral obligation for people like myself, who've had these experiences, to come out and talk about this, because I very well, I think about myself, if I was a gay man living in the 80s, I could have been one of the people that was was put on AZT, and I wouldn't be here today if that were the case.
Well, I really appreciate you sharing this. I think it's so important to hear stories from real people about real experiences that aren't this shiny, simple message that the AIDS establishment is trying to send.
Right.
And I think, too, that in providing a venue for these stories, these are probably, this podcast and a few websites are the only places that these stories will be told. I think this has to do, too, the scenario you described, David, in the doctor's office is one that's very difficult to imagine, but also the loss of faith and confidence that would occur if people heard stories like Mike's, like Richard, like Audrey's, like Jim's, often enough, as often as they occur, for example. I don't think anybody would be so into testing, and they would be demanding to know how these tests have been validated. What's the confirmatory that really establishes the virus being there?
Well, there are a number of doctors who've said that tests on low-risk populations are crazy. Doesn't matter what you're testing for, they should never be used on a low-risk population. Of course, the problem with an HIV test is it's really only prejudice that has described certain populations as high risk. Until you can validate the test, then what does it mean? How do you know that gay men are more likely than anybody else to be really truly HIV infected?
Well, yeah, and on that point, David, there are many people are experts in the field who were, at the forefront of, the AIDS epidemic, and I guess his name was Rodney Richards. He helped design some of these tests, these HIV tests, and he's actually come out and said that, the idea that we can test for HIV is an illusion. And then, Kerry Mullis, who I believe, didn't he also invent the PCR, the viral load test?
Yeah, he got the Nobel Prize for Chemistry in 1993 for inventing polymerase chain reaction, and the viral load test is essentially a polymerase chain reaction. Right,
and it just blows my mind that, these people who actually invented these tests have actually come out and said, look, these tests cannot detect HIV, and, they're being used every day to do that.
Another thing, too, with regard to Rodney Richards is he does lectures where he shows these studies that were conducted, I think in the early 1990s, one-of-a-kind studies, because they showed that HIV tests, as they're called, are not reproducible. And
right.
It would be very difficult to get funding to do them again when they had such dismal results. But there's two studies, published studies, that he refers to in his talks, and what they show is that when you send the same sample to various labs for so-called HIV testing, you get a whole bunch of different results. And further, in another study, when you send one sample over and over again to the same lab, you still get all kinds of different results.
Yeah, and I think in 1999, wasn't it, the CDC actually did their own test, and I guess they sent the same blood sample to 500 different labs, and they got basically 500 different answers. So as far as the proteins on the Western blot. So, yeah, and obviously in my case, it totally was made very apparent to me. My Western blot was all over the place. Neither test was even close.
Yes, well, and there's a great story in John Crutzen's book, Science Fictions, where Robert Gallo sits down with somebody from the CDC whose name I can't remember, and they say, Bob, your test hasn't worked out too well. It's not doing too well at distinguishing between people who are have AIDS and people who don't. So then Bob got really upset, and they adjusted the results. They kind of slid the slider a little bit, and they said, okay, well, if we move the cutoff for positive negative a little bit to the right or the left, we can do better, and we can pass the grade for being an accurate test. Incredible story.
Yeah, are you talking about the dilution of the test?
No. This was like before these tests had actually been released in the public. They were doing these laboratory validations. The CDC was trying to validate the French test versus the American, and the American test from Bob Gallo wasn't doing very well. It wasn't distinguishing people who had AIDS from those who didn't very well at all. So they basically fudged the results in order that the American test wouldn't be embarrassed. And besides, the CDC people knew that Gallo would have their hides if they didn't approve his test. So
yeah, and I think that's a good point, David, because I don't think that the that the general public realizes that there's no standardized test. I mean, they use one test to test another test, but none of these tests have ever been validated against a gold standard against isolating or purifying this virus.
Well, yeah, I mean, most people think that there's test and it's positive or negative. They don't realize that to be HIV positive is to have gone through 3-4 tests, all of which are interpreted in different ways, and that the category HIV positive is the sum of all these 4 tests, and that each of those individual tests are not really positive or negative. There may be a color change or the size of a blot or the intensity of a blot. And if it goes above a certain line, then it's positive, and if it's below, it's negative. And
then there's also, too, the situation where the lines are drawn vary between government agencies, private clinics, and so forth. For example, the highest standard for testing positive, according to their interpretation, is with the Department of Defense. And their reason is they don't want to have to turn away any new recruits who test positive, so they set a very high standard for what a positive result is, whereas Red Cross has a very low standard because they want to make absolutely sure the blood supply is as safe as possible.
Yeah, that's amazing. I've never heard that.
So and then everybody else is somewhere in between.
Well, and also with the Western blot, I believe that isn't the Western blot also interpreted differently depending on what country you live in?
Yeah, the Perth group, I think, has documented 10 different methods for interpreting the Western blot. And, it's different number of proteins have to be positive, different types of proteins. It's incredible, the difference. So it would be very easy to go from positive to indeterminate.
Yeah, so you could live in Africa and be positive and move to Australia and be negative.
Yes.
And all you did, Richard, was just drive across town.
Yeah, you found it much more efficient.
I just drove 20 minutes down the street. So.
Yes. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. Christine, do you have any more questions to ask Richard? This has been incredible.
I don't. I just want to thank you for spending some time with us and for sharing a very interesting story that's probably a little bit difficult to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you guys for having me.
Yeah, we're so grateful, and I think people who listen to this will benefit immensely, and from the other stories that are going to be told on this podcast too.
Well, that's my hope. So that's definitely my hope.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
so much.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye. David, I don't know about you, but I hear these kinds of stories all the time. People write to me through the Alive and Well website, call me, pull me aside when I give a talk somewhere, and reiterate these same kind of stories that, to look at the mainstream media and what AIDS experts tell us, you would think never happen or are so rare.
Yeah, they would say this is a 1 in a million case, and I don't think that's true at all. People have a great deal of difficulty with this, and a lot of people may just keep getting tested, and then eventually they get maybe 3 positives in a row, and they say, okay, I'm positive, or they get 3 negatives in a row, and they say they're negative, and then they kind of forget about it. I think it's so powerful that Mike and Richard have shared their story in so much detail that other people may go, that happened to me. Maybe I should tell my story, or maybe I should talk to my friend who just got tested the other day and suggest they get tested again, or think about what the test means.
I think it's interesting that neither Richard nor Mike wanted to share this story with anybody, and probably don't bring it up very often. So again, how often does this happen? We really don't know. And I know sometimes when we talk about the uncertainties of the rapid test, the ELISA, the Western blot, PCR, people will say, well, what test is there that truly finds the virus, that someone can take and find out for sure if, in fact, they're HIV infected? And the unfortunate answer is there is no such test.
Well, I was thinking at some point in the future we should phone the CDC's helpline and ask them a few questions on tape.
That would be fun.
Yes.
That would be interesting.
That's for another show.
Yeah, and that pretty much winds up this one for today.
Yeah, goodbye, everybody. Thanks for listening.
Bye.